Well, South Africa's female homicide levels are 5 times higher than the global average. That's according to a report by the Medical Research Council released in 2009. Gender violence and femicide have again come under the spotlight in the country following the recent brutal killing of Karabo Mokoena. To try and understand the reasons behind gender violence, SABC News spoke earlier to expert Lisa Vetten.
Well, it suggests that we have a problem because, as you noted earlier, our homicide rates for women killed by their partners is 5 times that of the global average. But we do have to say that in many countries of the world, there hasn't been this kind of research. But I think we also have to locate that within our high levels of violence generally, because not only do we have very high levels of women being killed by their partners, we also have very high levels of men killing each other. So I think if we look at these two figures together, they tell us something about the state of masculinity in South Africa and our need to do something to break this link between masculinity and violence, because it's not only doing harm to women, it's also doing a great deal of harm to men.
Now, the stats that I quoted I think dates back to 2009. Why don't we have updated stats yet?
Because the police don't collect this sort of data. You know, when they put out their statistics every year, they don't disaggregate victims by gender, and they also don't record the relationship between perpetrator and victim. So you just don't know. In order to have this information, you actually have to go out and do the work yourself, going through police dockets or mortuaries.
Does that then also suggest that the numbers could be higher?
The numbers could very well be higher, because I think what we have to take into account is that homicide rates in South Africa started increasing again in about 2012. For the last 3 years, we have seen them being on an increase. So it is possible the rate has gone up.
Now, before femicide is committed, it seems that women are normally afraid to call for help. Why is that the case?
Well, you know, the unfortunate problem is we don't know enough about all of the cases. In probably about a third, we can see there was a history of domestic violence beforehand. But for the other 2/3, we don't know. And this tells us something about the quality of police investigation, that they don't ask these questions. It sometimes also perhaps might tell us something about the secretive nature of domestic violence, that it's kept hidden. But I think also that some of these murders, we just don't know what happened. There is no history of violence. The couple appear to get on. Family and friends are taken by complete surprise. And the man feigns a complete amnesia. He cannot remember what he did. So we have different types of murders, which I think is important to recognize, because it means we need to have different ways of trying to intervene with them if we want to try and do something about the problem.
So it seems that many of these cases are either underreported, and if they are reported, it seems like after a while the woman would retract the cases from the police. Why do you think is that the case? You know,
domestic violence is a complicated problem to deal with, and it needs lots of different sorts of solutions. Unfortunately, in South Africa, we offer women a protection order or arresting the man, and that's it. We don't take cognizance of the fact that many women do not have alternative accommodation, and we have a housing crisis in South Africa, so they're not first on the list for alternative housing. We have very high rates of unemployment. We don't have good job training schemes that women can go to, especially if they're financially dependent on their partners. So I think if we don't look at the economic dimensions of domestic violence, we're not going to address the problem. Plus, I think we also underestimate that there are strong feelings between this couple. A lot of women still hope their partners will change. So that's why they withdraw the charges. And I think we also have to recognize that many women are terrified of their partners. The second most common reason precipitating women's murder is them trying to leave or end the relationship. And that's something we should never forget when we keep on saying, oh, but why doesn't she leave? The answer is because it's very dangerous for her to do so, and the irony is she might just be safer with him for that point in time.
Let's talk about motives. In my introduction I mentioned financial, adultery, or even perhaps a love triangle. Are that the only motives for such a murder?
Not at all. The most common murder tends to be motive is jealousy. So the suspicion that the woman might be having an affair. That tends to trigger homicides. Next is leaving, wanting to end the relationship. The third most common motive probably has to do with women not obeying the man or behaving in the way he wants her to. So not cooking on time, not washing his clothes, not keeping the children quiet, going out with her friends when he didn't want her to. So those are very much motives about who's in control and who makes the decisions in the relationship. And then, of course, as you mentioned, there are the financial motives. And then I think there are the cases where you just don't know what happened. And the man is not going to tell you either, because for legal reasons he's claiming he has no memory.
What does patriarchy play in fueling domestic violence, especially here in South Africa?
You know, I think it creates the basis and the conditions for violence to occur, because of course not everybody who grows up in a patriarchal society goes on to be violent, but it lays the base. And I think when you add that problems such as somebody possibly having a history of childhood neglect and abuse, and this doesn't just happen to poor men, this happens to middle class men as well, a lack of attachment, a sense of love, if they are abused themselves, that is often not a very, when you combine that with a patriarchal society that encourages men to believe they should always be in charge, that they're the one who makes the decisions in the relationship, you are setting up a very dangerous problem, especially if you still add on top of that a criminal justice system that isn't always responsive, police that don't always come, neighbours who turn the other way, and family members who will say, go back, give him another chance. In our family, we don't have divorces. Go back, give him another chance. Put those together and you have a dangerous situation.
Patriarchy versus woman empowerment in the 21st century. How did the two clash?
You know, we have quite shallow ideas about women empowerment in South Africa that can often, unfortunately, I think, be reinvented in quite patriarchal terms. I mean, I've seen a lot of women's empowerment being reinvented on how to dress nicely and how to wear makeup and how to go for a good job interview, and that's being presented as women's empowerment. That's a very shallow way of trying to understand it. What is not working as well it should, and where I think we should be focusing on women's empowerment, is doing something about high rates of women's unemployment. We're talking about radical economic transformation in South Africa, but it has no gendered dimensions. It doesn't recognize the kind of work that women do. It doesn't recognize the gender pay cap. And obviously, it doesn't create any kinds of solutions as to how we deal with that. So unless we talk about that, I think much of our talk about women's empowerment tends to be awfully superficial and cosmetic.
15 seconds. How do we resolve some of these issues?
We make the police more responsive to domestic violence. Friends and family do not force women to go back. And when they see their friend or their husband or their son behaving abusively, they say to him, stop that. And I think we also create good services so that women have somewhere to go where they can be safe and they can take their children with them, so there are programs that children don't repeat the cycle of violence.